Hello, my name is Stuart, a classical record collector. I also sell classical records. My website URL is below this video, or at least it will be. Okay, yeah, so the question I'm asking is, do vinyl records actually sound better than CDs and streaming? So in order to answer this question, I'm going to describe to you my journey from being a teenager, experiencing records for the first time in the 70s, all the way through to when CDs arrived, and then my journey between sort of CDs, records, streaming, etc., and how I eventually reverted back to my roots. And now, really, more or less, just listen to records all the time, except for when I'm in the car, because obviously you can't have vinyl in the car. The only record player I've ever seen in a car is that famous Laurel and Hardy film where they've got a 78s player in the engine. Apart from that, I've never seen a record player in a car. But so yeah, CD is ideal for a car. But let me just go back. Let's just trace back my own experiences with vinyl. So it goes back to the early 70s when my earliest recollection of vinyl is basically we had this little sort of portable player. It could only play 45s. I seem to remember it was a little portable player. It had a speaker built into it, and it connected to the mains, and it only played 45s. Now that's bad enough, but what's even worse is that I only remember two singles that I had. So I got this little record player, and I only had two singles, and I remember what those singles were, and this is absolutely laughable. But one of them was Puppy Love by Donny Osmond. And the other one was, I think it's a song called Grocer Jack from some kind of musical. I'm not sure if that's the actual title of the song, but it kind of went, Grocer Jack, get off your back, get into town, don't let us down. It's quite a sad song about, this old man who everybody relies on him. He's up early running his grocery store, and he dies, of course, and it's sad and everything. People only really just wanted him because he earned money, and they didn't really seem to value him for any other reason than that. They just needed somebody to feed them, and then he died, and then nobody really noticed. So yeah, really sad song. But so I remember playing those two records one after the other, and I knew the words for Puppy Love, and I knew the words for Donny Osmond, for the Donny Osmond, and also for the other Grocer Jack song. I played them so many times. I overplayed those records. I was only about 7, 8 years old. So that was my first experience with vinyl. I remember being quite curious about how does the sound actually get from... Now imagine that you're 7, 8 years old and you've got no experience of recorded sound really, and you're just conscious now that, okay, you know about radio, but you don't know about sort of formats. You've got a record and you look at it, you put it on the record player and you play it, the sound comes out of the speaker and you're looking at the needle, you're thinking, how does that black piece of plastic convert into actual sound? It's really quite strange. And I remember that I turned the record player off and I put the record down, the 45, I lowered the needle onto it, and I very slowly with my finger actually rotated the record. By the way, there's only two of you watching at the moment, but anybody who wants to leave chat and join in, ask me any questions, they're welcome. So yeah, I was curious, how do you get sound out of that little black piece of plastic? And I actually put the needle down, and as I moved it, I could hear directly, not through the speakers, I could actually hear sound coming from the record. Now that really fascinated me, and I reasoned that there was some kind of undulation, some kind of texture on the vinyl that the stylus was somehow converting into a signal, and it was being amplified and played out through the speakers. I kind of figured that out when I was 7 or 8 years old, and I did find it fascinating. So fast forward from that experience until the, when would it be? Probably the mid to late 70s. So my mother's partner, he actually, now, I mean, my father was never really into music. He never had a record player. He had a radio, which he took to work with him. He was a painter and decorator, and he would take that to work with him. And he also took me to work with him as well. And he gave me a little transistor radio. That transistor radio was like life-changing. That was really a life-changing little thing. And it could still be so today. I had a little transistor radio. I would play with the dial, and it wasn't a dial. It was just one of those kind of, it was like a sort of window at the top showing AM. There was no FM, just AM. And, you know, like 200, 300, 500. And then I would just twiddle it at the side and get into a radio station. And the strongest radio station seemed to be Radio 1. And so the first song I remember listening to on the radio was Rock On by David Essex. That's the first one I can remember. It may not be the first one I actually did listen to, but that's the one that's stuck in my memory. John Shaw, you're asking, did you ever try to play 78 RPM records, or were you too young? No, I never really played a 78. No, I never did. And the first time I saw 78 was in the late 70s. I remember the date. It was 1979. Now, I'm half Scottish, and my grandfather was a professional accordion player back in the 30s. He was quite well known, and he made some recordings for a record company called Beltona. He made about 24 different recordings, and there are about a dozen different 78s out there with his name on it. And my uncle was a big fan, obviously, and he'd collected these records, and he brought through a portable wind-up little 78s player. He brought it with him, and he was playing these records to us, and it was about 1979. That was the first time I actually ever saw 78. And by the way, if I could get any of those records, they're 78s, I'd be prepared to pay some money for, but I just never see them around. Okay, so let me just continue. Where was I? Yes, so my father never really listened to music. My mother really didn't much either. I mean, we listened to Top of the Pops and on the radio, but we never actually had a sound system. So the first sound system I saw was after my mother divorced. Her partner, David, his name was, he had a credible size record collection, you know, enough to fill. Do you remember those units that you would put in a kind of wardrobe, you know, kind of entertainment unit that you could fit a television into, you could fit a music center, and then there was room to put your records as well. So he had one of these, and he had maybe 100 records, 200 maybe. And actually, he had what I would call his good taste. He had several Pink Floyd albums. He had the Eagles. He had Bread, you know, like The Sound of Bread. He had Simon and Garfunkel, Bridge Over Troubled Water. You know, he had a lot of the records that you would expect a person to have, you know, with that kind of taste, I suppose. He had what I would call classical, fairly good taste in popular culture. I was fortunate I looked at how he used the record player. I'd never really seen LPs before, or at least I'd never used them. And I got an idea how to use these. Oh, he also had Yes. He liked the pop group Yes. Yes Songs was one of the albums that he had. Yep, he had some really good stuff. Genesis, Selling England by the Pound, he had that as well. So, that's the first time when I discovered a proper record player. It was a kind of music center, but it didn't have a tape player built in. I think it was just like a radio, and there was a record player that could play either 78s, 45s, or 33s. So he also had headphones. So this was really my first introduction to anything like kind of decent sound quality. Yeah. So I I also wanted a record player because I had slightly different taste from him. So while he was listening to Pink Floyd, the Eagles, Yes, Genesis, I was getting into Blondie, Queen, and some other groups, the Boomtown Rats, and you know, um, I wanted a record player so that obviously I could have my own records and play them. So I went to, this is my first record player. This is the time we all remember when we had our first record player. Forget about that little portable 45s player that I had, because I never bought that. It was given to me. But I wanted my own record player. Now, the problem was, in those days, for me to buy a record player, I was 14 years old. I had no real kind of income. I got a bit of pocket money. I didn't have a part-time job. I did a bit later, but I didn't then. And it would have been impossible for me to buy my own record player. I just didn't have the money. And in today's money, even the cheapest record player you could buy in the shops probably would have been about £200 or £300. In those days, we're talking about maybe 20 or 30 pounds. So I can't remember under what circumstances I got this record player. It's possible that Dave or my mother bought me this record player for my birthday or Christmas. I can't remember. But we went to, I think it was Curry's in those days. It was one of the major electrical stores. And we went in and we bought this record player. I can't remember how much it was, but it came with speakers and it had an amplifier built into it. So as far as I recall, the speakers were just they weren't very good. They were like fairly thin, like that. And they were just sort of bookshelf speakers, which connected up to the back of the to the record player. And there was an amplifier built into it. And, but I mean, it was amazing. It was an amazing introduction for me to have my own record player. And I think the first album I bought was Parallel Lines, Blondie, which cost me £5, which in today's money is about £45. So yeah, that was my first record. And what did I buy? What else did I buy? I think I managed to get hold of a couple of Queen albums, Queen 1 and Queen 2. So I managed to get myself a job. That guy, Dave, he wasn't around much longer, but I remember I also wanted to tape the records because I had a tape player and I wanted to tape these records. But when I connected up, I asked this Dave if he could help me connecting it up to the tape player. And, he managed to fashion a cable directly from the output on the record player into this mono tape player, which had a 3.5 input mic jack, and he managed to make a cable for that purpose. However, when I actually came to do the recording, all I could get was a horrible crackling sound on the record on the tape player. And I remember going back to the shop and asking for advice. I went back to Curry's. They couldn't really give me much advice. I only remember the old guy in the shop saying, "You need a potentiometer." Well, I had no idea what a potentiometer was, and Dave didn't really either. So I kind of failed at that. I never did manage to get a tape player hooked up to that record player. And I envied my friends who had music centers with, especially with Dolby sound system on them, the Dolby button, because The Wall, which came out, I think, in 1979, Pink Floyd, I didn't have enough money to buy it, and somebody lent me a copy. Somebody gave me a copy on tape on a very good quality SA-TDK chrome dioxide tape, and it was absolutely fabulous to have it. But I was having to play it on my little mono tape recorder. I didn't even have a stereo tape in those days, but it was better than nothing. So I never did manage to get a tape player hooked up to that record player, but it was okay. It was a really good introduction to vinyl. And yeah, then I moved on. I mean, my next memory really of it, I don't know what happened, because I know that I moved away from my mother, went to live with my father, and he had a record player. He had a record player by that time, and he only had a few records. He was a big Pavarotti fan. And he had some Pavarotti records, but nothing really else. So that wasn't much good. I mainly listened to tapes, I think, in those days. So then for the next few years, I didn't really have a sound system at all. I think I probably had a stereo cassette, which I used. That's probably what I had. I can't say for certain if that's what I had. And then eventually, of course, I started working and getting together some of my own money. And I had a friend who I used to go to his house, and we would listen to music. And he had a Pioneer amplifier. He had a pair of Wharfdale Dovedale speakers, huge things, and he had a dual record player. Right now, I was in business by this time, and I was earning quite good money. The CD revolution had arrived. I knew about it, and I was all for it. I thought, great. I mean, I had no particular affection for records. If there was a better format, then, I wanted it. And CD seemed to me like the perfect answer. No more, you didn't have to change the side. You got like an hour of music, an hour or more of music. And these little shiny discs would just pop in and they would play. And you had a remote control, and it was just absolute bliss. I had a good CD player. I had a CD 50 SE. I had what amplifier did I have? I can't remember what amplifier I had, oddly enough. But I had a pair of Rogers LS4A speakers. Now, those Rogers speakers were absolutely fabulous. They were like so clear. They were so, I believe the BBC used them to monitor audio in the studios, and they were such good speakers, those Rogers LS4s. So I had quite not a bad system. I had the CD 50 SE, and I had the Rogers, and I had an amplifier, but I can't remember what the amplifier was. And I started buying CDs. I was into classical music by this time, and I was spending a lot of money on CDs, opera sets, and all sorts of stuff. So I really enjoyed that system. However, I was going to my friend's house, and of course, he'd only had a record player. He hadn't yet bought a CD player. And he would put on records. He would put on records. I would joke with him and say, get up to date. Get yourself a CD player. And, records are old-fashioned. People are getting rid of their collections. What are you doing? Now, the only thing with that was that he would play records when I was there. And I've got quite a critical ear. And, okay, it was a different system. He had these big Dovedale speakers. And, he had a Pioneer amplifier. But nevertheless, even taking that into account, I couldn't help noticing that there was something fundamentally different about vinyl sound compared with CD sound. I mean, there was something going on at some level that I couldn't put my finger on, but it was almost like there was almost some more tangible quality in the sound that was coming out of the speakers of vinyl compared with CD. And I let this impression kind of gradually build on me. And it's not that I became disgruntled with CDs, but I happened to find a secondhand record player at a car boot sale. I bought that and a few records. I can't remember what the record player was. It was just a cheap record player. But I must admit that, it started to grow on me. And before long, I found that I was listening to more records than CDs, which was really weird because my friend had actually bought a CD player and he was getting into CDs, and he was no no longer listening to records. And excuse me, it's tired. It's late here. It's 12:10, midnight. Yeah. So he was completely bought on CDs, and I was starting to doubt. So much so that I was starting to buy quite a lot of records, either from record shops or just secondhand records from car boot sales or whatever. And then at some point, I decided that I was going to buy a quality record player. Yeah. And I had the money to do it because in those days, I was earning, in today's money, in those days, I was earning about 100,000 a year. I was in the computer business. I had a computer shop, 2 computer shops at one time, plus I was wholesaling and doing all sorts of stuff. I was earning really good money, so money was no object. And I mean, I didn't go for like an ultra expensive turntable, but where I was living at the time, which was Derby, there was a hi-fi shop. I can't remember what it was called or where it was. Yeah. I went into this shop and I said, "Oh, I'd like to buy a decent record player. What have you got?" And they said, "Oh, we've got." They showed me a few different ones, and there was one I liked the look of. And appearance is so important with a record player because I mean, it doesn't just do a beautiful thing. I mean, it's a thing of beauty itself. I absolutely drool over record players just looking at them. I just love the look of them as well as the sound of them. And I saw this record player. It was a System Deck 2X. It had a kind of black wood finish, and it looked kind of nice. And I had a moth arm on it with a gold ring 1042 cartridge, and I think it cost me about £300, which in today's money, how much is that? In today's money, it's probably about £1,000 or so. So I bought that, and it was such a massive improvement on what I'd had before. It was just an unbelievable improvement. And not just that, it was better than my friend's system. He'd got this dual record player. So that was absolutely amazing. I'll just answer Dr. Rapperband. Personally, I think the sampling frequency was too low on CDs. The extra processing reduces the musicality. Yeah, well, maybe that's the case with records as well. I mean, with analog recordings as well. Quadraphonic. Oh, you've got a System Deck 2X900. Good player, isn't it? I wish I'd never sold it. What cartridge have you got on that? What arm? Yeah, I really enjoyed that turntable. I just felt that it blew away my Marantz CD50 SE. I mean, I felt that the sound quality coming out of the Marantz was too clinical, too harsh. If you crank the volume up, it's too hard on the ears. I felt there was something missing musically. There was something missing. Something was not quite happening for me. That when I played the System Deck and the records, everything was there. It was like, it was like comparing a black and white photo with a color photo. Now, I know that there are a lot of CD people out there who will disagree, but that's how I perceive it to be anyway. That's how I still perceive it to be. So, I had the System Deck, and I really started buying records, a lot of them. I used to visit various dealers in classical music, and I was building up my collection. And I mean, look, people had said, "Oh, all those crackles and pops, and oh god, the record's jumping." And I never really had any of that because I bought records in good condition. And it's like now with my Riga Planer 2 that I've got, I very rarely encounter any problems with condition on records. Luckily, classical records tend to be fairly well looked after. I don't buy records with scratches or that look like they're in poor condition. And I just don't have that problem. I play a record and it's very rare that I get a jump or a skip or any crackles and pops, and the surface noise is remarkably low or just can't hear the surface noise at all. I've got all the advantages of CD, except that obviously I only get 25 minutes playing time on one side. That's the one disadvantage, but I can live with that for the superior sound quality as I perceive it to be. So yeah, just going back. Now with the Marantz, I was a bit frustrated with it, and I'd read a lot in hi-fi magazines that the digital to audio converter in the Marantz and other CD players was not really that good, and that these CDs sounded a lot more like vinyl if you would invest in a good quality DAC. So I bought a Meridian. Does anybody know what that is? Yeah, I bought a Meridian DAC, a digital audio converter. All of the hi-fi magazines were giving it rave reviews, and they were saying how it transforms the sound of virtually any CD player. So I went ahead and bought it. I paid £300 for mine. It's quite a bit of money. That's like £1,000 today for a digital audio converter. I must say it did improve the sound quality quite significantly. That the rough edges on the CD, I wouldn't say they'd gone completely, but they were a lot better. I'd say it was more of a kind of a creamy sound compared with what I'd experienced before. But I still didn't think it sounded as good as a record player. So eventually I sold the Marantz, and I sold the Meridian as well, by the way. I managed to get my money back on it. And I kind of ignored CDs from that point and started buying records. Now, I decided to go one step further, and I went to audition a Lynn Sondek LP12. Something that I probably shouldn't have done because I was happy with the system deck, but the people, the dealer that I went to see, they did such a good job on selling me that LP12. And I mean, to be fair, yeah, it was better than the system deck, really. I mean, it had that beautiful stainless steel platter, and you know, it was black, and the arm looked nice and everything. It was and it had this lovely Perspex cover. Yeah, it was nice. It was a nice record player to have. So I enjoyed my Lynn Sondek for a while, and then a friend of mine went into the record player manufacturing business, and he wanted to sell me one of his record players. He had a prototype that he brought around, and he explained to me, he called himself Riverlin Audio. I mean, the company never really amounted to much. He only really made half a dozen of these, but I had one of them, and I must admit I was impressed with it. I thought it was at least as good as the Lynn, if not better. Consequently, I sold the Lynn, and I bought his turntable off him for a low price, actually, given that I was a friend of his. So I got that, and he put on it an SME 3009 arm. Quite a complicated arm, actually, to set up. It's got a sort of one of those little weights on it on a piece of nylon for the bias. And it used to take me ages to set up that arm. I'm not convinced I ever had it set up properly. So Thrift Store Vinyl is asking, have you ever listened to SACD? No, I heard about it. Well, I presume that I should have done so. No, I never did. Is that a special format of CD, or is that a playback? Is that a special kind of CD player? I presume that S stands for super something CD. No, I never did, actually. That would have been interesting. I never did. So just coming back to what I was saying, yeah, I had the Lynn Sondek, and then I sold it, and I got this Riverlin Eclipse with a 3009 and a Shure VST5 moving magnet cartridge, which at the time a lot of people were saying this is the best moving magnet cartridge around. Well, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I must say that it had a lot of finesse to it. It had a dynamic stabilizer on it, and you know, the smoothness of the presentation. I mean, the days of harsh violins, the days of screeching violins from a CD were frankly over for me. And even on records, if you haven't got the right stylus, if you haven't got the right setup, violins can be a bit fierce. So that Shure VST5 cartridge and the stylus, which I think in those days was £200 alone just for the stylus, really did a beautiful job of giving me exactly the kind of presentation that I wanted, which was a very sort of neutral, laid back, warm sound with, you know, smooth top end and well-defined bottom end. And I listened to classical music and opera a lot, not so much pop music, but actually on pop music, it was amazing as well. I remember I had somebody around to my house. In fact, he was the guy who was selling the Meridian. I remember that, yeah. And I had Mr. Blue Sky on the turntable, ELO. I said, "Oh, do you want to hear my record player?" He said, "Yeah, all right then." So I played in Mr. Blue Sky on my record player with the sound cranked up quite reasonably well. Now on a CD, if you did that, your ears would be shredded in those days. But, well, he was impressed. I mean, I knocked his socks off. He just sat there after the song played out. He sat there and he was just nodding like this. And then he shook his head and he said, "Very impressive." I mean, no, I mean, you know, sometimes people compliment a system just to be polite, and I've done it myself. But, you know, I could tell that he was really impressed with, you know, with the capability of my system. Now, what did I have? I had a Croft preamp power combination, valves, and I had a Target wall-mounted turntable support. I had a friend come and drill the holes, make sure everything was set up properly. So I had a Target turntable support with that Eclipse sitting on top of it. And then underneath that, I had another Target stand for the valve amplifier and for my Denon cassette deck. And I had an Arcam audio tuner. Okay. Now for the speakers, I had a pair of Kefs, floor standing. You know, they weren't too big. They were kind of, I don't know, a bit more than a meter maybe. But I'd heard them in somebody's house and I was really impressed. You know, I was really impressed with these Kefs. And I went out and managed to get a pair secondhand. I paid about, what did I pay for them? In those days, secondhand, I paid about $600 or $700 for them. I think they sold for $1,200, $1,300 new. And I bought them off a guy in a service station on the M1. He had them in the back of his SUV, and I did the deal with him there and then. So yeah, I had quite a good system. Not like sort of like, you know, you see these 50 grand systems that people are showing off on YouTube, because I've got my limits in terms of how much I was going to spend on hi-fi. And I thought that what I'd spent, which is a few thousand, would be enough, really. I think that it got me quite a good system. So, yeah, I was really happy with that system. And everything was fine. You know, I went into the record business eventually. I had my own record shop for a while. And then I just focused on collectible classical records. And so I was fine. I never looked back. I didn't really listen to CDs that often, very rarely. Yeah, Super Audio CD. I've heard of it, but I've never listened to it. Thrift store vinyl. But I don't suppose I probably ever will either. I've got a Sony CD player now. Let me just tell you what it is. Oh dear, what's it called? It's right. It's a CDP-212. Yeah, if you look that up, Sony CDP-212. It's a 90s Sony CD player. Actually, it sounds quite reasonable. I'm quite happy with it for when I do play CDs. You know, it sounds okay. It's unlikely that I'll, you know, go and listen to SACD, but no, I never did hear it. It would have been interesting, though, to compare the difference. Okay, so my conversion was complete. My conversion was utterly complete for vinyl. And I was convinced that it did sound better than CD, even though I knew that technically it didn't match up. It's like I was watching a video that somebody put out. Yeah, what's his name? He's got a no, that's not him. No, there's somebody who's got a sort of hi-fi channel. He listens to vinyl, and he was saying that he knows that the numbers prove that CD is better, but it proves that CD is better, but vinyl sounds better. It's a strange anomaly, but that's how it is. It shouldn't do, but it is. Okay, so what happened basically was that eventually I got married. Okay. Now, when you're married and bringing up a child and you've got domestic cares, it's not so easy to run a hobby like, listening to records, prioritizing music listening. We were a very busy household, and eventually my son was a young musician, and really that occupied most of the time that we had. So eventually I didn't really listen to records very much, and I think that I kept that record player throughout the marriage, and eventually I got divorced in 2021, and I took my system with me. The Croft had gone. The Croft and the Kef, they'd both gone because I got into a bit of money trouble. Yeah, I got into a bit of money trouble. I mean, I was the sole breadwinner, and I always had enough money as a single man myself, but I was out of my depth when it came to raising a family, and basically it wiped out all the money that I had. Really, all my money went on music lessons and education fees, etc., etc., etc. The mortgage, shopping on Waitrose for organic food. You get the picture. So there was no room, there was no money really for any of that. So yeah, so I divorced in 2021, and I got my flat. I had my record player still, got it out, and I had a Cambridge Audio amp by this time, which I've still got, by the way, and I've got some LTAC speakers, little bookshelf speakers. So I was using my system, and well, actually, it's embarrassing to admit, but I sold that record player to somebody. I sold it on eBay, and I don't have that record player anymore. I don't know. I went through a time in my life a couple of years ago, where I was trying to reduce all my material possessions. And I remember I sold the record player. For some reason, I went very indifferent on vinyl, and I just didn't care. I was listening to CDs, and I just went very indifferent on vinyl. I don't know. Maybe some of you guys have gone indifferent on vinyl as well now and again. And I just didn't care. I suppose other things that happened in my life, and I was trying to sort of pull my life together after the divorce. So eventually, yeah, I sold that, and I moved from England to Scotland. And I've got my system here, the CD player with my LTAC speakers and my Cambridge Audio, and I just listen to CDs. I've got a couple of hundred CDs. You can buy them really cheap in shops, and that's okay. And if I wasn't listening to CDs, I would just listen on YouTube, MP3 quality. And let's face it, it's not bad. It's not bad at all. You can get enjoyment out of it, MP3 quality. At least I can. Didn't have any problem with it. And then one day in a charity shop here where I live in Scotland, I happened to see a record player. In fact, I've got it here, and I'll show it to you. If you'll bear with me a moment, I'll just pick it up and show it to you. Right, here it is. That's it. So it's a Bush MTT1, right? It's obviously not a serious record player, but I've been looking in that shop that charity shop, and they've got electrical goods. I'd seen record players in there before, but the stylus was always screwed, or there was always something wrong with the head shell or something. And I'm not going to buy a record player like that if it needs work doing to it. If I'm going to pay money for a record player from a charity shop, I want it to work as soon as I bring it home. So I saw this one. I could see the stylus wasn't in good condition, and I think I paid £10 for it. I thought, well, I'll have it for that money because I've still got records. I'd stopped dealing years ago, but I still had 100 records or so. So I got it back, hooked it up. I wanted to check it works first, and that stylus was okay. It could get sound out of the system, but it was in poor condition. So what did I do? I ordered a new stylus through eBay, which was about £7. That arrived, and actually it worked quite well. I was surprised. Suddenly all the memories of vinyl came flooding back to me, and I fancied that even this cheap player sounded better than my CD player. So I used that for a little while, but having said that, I must admit, of course there were problems with that little Bush player. Of course there were problems. I mean, for a start, records were jumping where they shouldn't have been jumping, and the pitch stability wasn't good. The speed control was not good. I thought maybe it's the belt. No, it wasn't really the belt. I looked at the belt. It was in good condition. And yeah, but I mean, it was okay. It was okay to get me going on vinyl again. And eventually, of course, what happened? Well, eventually I basically, I decided to get a better record player. I decided to get a better record player, which you can find on my YouTube channel. If you go back several months, you'll find me asking questions. What shall I do? Which record player shall I buy for up to £500? So I thought, that's what I'll spend on a record player. That's what I feel comfortable with, and I think I could get a reasonable player for that amount of money. And I put out the question, what shall I buy? And I listed about 6 different alternatives. And somebody said, well, the only one of those that's a real true hi-fi turntable is the Riga. All the rest are kind of, looks are more important than sound, or they're a bit gimmicky. And so somebody said the only one of those that's got any credibility on the hi-fi forums is the Riga. And that kind of resonated with me, because I remember back in the 90s, people were talking about Rigas, and a lot of them were very enthusiastic, saying, oh God, don't bother with the pink triangle. Don't bother with the Lin, get a Riga. They're really good, and, and not expensive as well. So, yeah. So I bought this Riga on eBay. I got it from a Riga dealer in the original box with an Armand cartridge in virtually new condition for about £350. And I've been very happy with it. To be honest with you, I've not even bothered changing the stylus. I've only got the basic carbon stylus that came with it. But obviously it sounds dramatically better than what I've had. And I will change the stylus at some point and get a better stylus, but it does a good enough job as far as I'm concerned so far. It's, I mean, there are some things that I can recognize that a better stylus would do a much better job. Of course, absolutely. But overall, when the stylus hits the groove, what's coming out of the speakers sounds really nice. So I'll leave it for now, and I'll probably get an Audio-Technica cartridge a bit later on, maybe when I've had a couple of hundred more hours playing out of this. So just coming back to my original question, do I still think that vinyl is better than CD and streaming? And my answer is yes. Now, look, I knew somebody a couple of years ago who had quite a flash BMW, and he told me he'd spent $7,000 on a hi-fi system, and he put it in his car. I said, wow, $7,000. What have you put in your car? And he said, oh, streaming. There's a streaming setup amplifier, speakers. Whew. I said, it must sound good for that amount of money. And he wanted me, specifically me, to come and listen to it. Excuse me. Now, this was a walking group I used to go out with, and he was a guy I used to talk to. And I suppose he asked me because I'd spoken about record players, and he probably figured that I knew something about hi-fi. Consequently, he valued my opinion. So I sat in his car and I asked him to, put a Mozart piano concerto on, and he did. And, he played it and I listened. And then I think he put some pop music on, the kind of thing that he listens to. And I mean, what could I say to him? I mean, yeah, it sounded to me like, it didn't really sound that much different to my CD system that I've got in my Volkswagen Passat that came fitted factory as standard. And actually, my CD player in my car sounds quite good, I think. And I didn't really think that his streaming system sounded dramatically better than my system. I think maybe marginally, yeah. Yeah, let's say it sounded a bit better. But, not really £7,000 worth better, I wouldn't have said. But I did say to him that, yeah, it sounds like a good system. I didn't overstate how good it sounds. I just gave my opinion. And I said, it's got some finesse to it. And it sounds very well balanced at the top end, the middle, and the bottom. And I made all the comments that you would make, that, you would expect somebody to make, somebody who knows at least a little bit about hi-fi and how they should sound and what you should be listening to. But it made me realize that, digital sound is good. Of course it is. And streaming is also good. And if I had to listen to that only, I would have no problems. If I couldn't listen to vinyl, I'd be quite happy listening to streaming. But I always think, and I still think now, that vinyl has got something extra. Vinyl does still sound better than streaming, and it sounds better than CD. It may well be down to the mastering, because they've got to master in such a way that the top end and the bottom end, I think they chop it slightly or they smooth it down to make sure that the stylus stays in the groove around those tight corners. It's quite possible that because they attenuate down some of what could sound harsh, that's where the sort of sweet, warm sound seems to come from. And of course, hi-fi purists will say, well, you're not listening to the music the way it was recorded, and yet you're saying it sounds better. I know it's bizarre, and I couldn't agree more. But what sounds good, sounds good. And if they've done that, because after all, what you're doing is recording an orchestra, which is a formidable piece of kit to record, and you're trying to listen to it in your lounge. So it might not actually be appropriate. And if you sit and listen to a live orchestra, those violins can grate on the ears a bit at times. And it may well be that the way they master vinyl is actually doing you a service. So it's quite a bizarre thing. I don't really understand it. But I still think that vinyl sounds better than CD and also streaming. But I admit that CD and streaming do sound very good. So that's about it, really. I think that I'll end this video here, and that's my conclusion. Yes, it does sound better, and I've given some reasons why I think it sounds better. I know that the engineers from the old days, the old school engineers, the way they record sound now is much more complex than the way they used to record it. And the way that Decca used to do their sound, when I first started listening to opera and I got some Decca performances on CD, the sound just absolutely blew me away. And I went back and I said to the people in the shop, I said, wow, the sound quality on that Decca recording, I didn't know that Decca was like, an audiophile label. They just said, oh yeah, they said those Decca engineers really knew what they were doing. And there must be more to it with Decca, because, their recordings are just absolutely phenomenal. the stereo series all the way through, even to the digital age. But I think there's one engineer that people look out for. Is it Ken Wilkinson? Was a famous Decca engineer, and they say that if you see his name on the back of an LP cover, you know you're in good hands. And yeah, I suppose that's the case. He certainly knew his stuff. Anyway, well, that's about it. I'll say goodnight to you. I'm going to end this stream now. So hope that's been useful to you. And I'll be uploading this. So goodbye for now.